Just after sunrise on a cool Saturday morning in September of 1994, at the Carter County Harvest Fair outside Lexington, Kentucky, 73-year-old Harold Mason eased his faded Farmall through the front gate, while conversations across the fairgrounds quietly stopped long enough for one young farmer to laugh and ask whether someone had accidentally driven the junkyard exhibit into the competition. Several people laughed with him, but Tyler Brooks wasn't finished because after climbing down from his brand-new John Deere, he walked to the front of the growing crowd, placed $10,000 in cash across the hood of his tractor, and loudly declared that if Harold's old Farmall managed to beat his Deere in the county plowing challenge, every dollar belonged to the old mechanic. Then he smiled, looked directly at Harold, and added that he hoped the old tractor didn't break down before the starting whistle because he hadn't brought enough time to wait for another repair. Harold never answered the laughter. He simply rested one weathered hand against the faded red hood of the Farmall, looked once across the freshly marked competition field, and quietly accepted a challenge that had never really been about tractors. Looking back, it would be easy to believe this story is about one tractor defeating another, but the tractors were never the real story. They simply became the stage upon which two very different ideas collided, because one man believed confidence came from what money could buy, while the other had spent an entire lifetime discovering that real confidence is earned one mistake, one repair, and one hard season at a time. By the end of that September afternoon, people would remember who won the county plowing challenge, but the lesson they carried home had very little to do with horsepower and everything to do with the quiet difference between knowing how to operate a machine and understanding why it works. Before we head back to Carter County, Kentucky, in the autumn of 1994, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. One of my favorite parts of this channel is seeing people from farms, ranches, small towns, and cities all over the world gather around stories like this. So leave your town, state, or country in the comments below. I'm also putting together a free Last Acre story archive featuring 25 forgotten rural stories, the real historical inspirations behind many of our videos, behind-the-scenes research notes, fascinating historical discoveries, and exclusive story ideas you won't find anywhere on the channel. I'll be sharing it first through the Community tab, so if you'd like to receive it when it becomes available, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you don't miss the announcement. Now, let's go back to that cool Saturday morning in September of 1994, because the story didn't begin with a $10,000 bet or a crowd waiting beside a freshly marked plowing field. It began decades earlier, when a young boy stood beside his father in a small repair shop and learned that a machine will always tell you what's wrong if you're patient enough to listen before trying to fix it. The first Saturday morning of September 1994 arrived cool and clear across Carter County, Kentucky, and long before the opening announcements echoed across the fairgrounds, pickup trucks had already begun filling the gravel parking lots as farmers wandered through rows of machinery discussing harvest forecasts, livestock prices, and the annual plowing challenge that had become one of the county's oldest traditions. For decades, the competition had never really been about finding the fastest tractor, because everyone understood that straight furrows, consistent depth, careful judgment, and reliable machinery mattered far more than raw horsepower, which was why the event drew as much respect from older farmers as it did excitement from younger ones eager to prove themselves. Among the first competitors to arrive was 73-year-old Harold Mason, who guided a faded red Farmall through the entrance with the same steady confidence that had carried him across thousands of fields during a lifetime spent farming and repairing tractors throughout Carter County. The Farmall showed its age without apology because the paint had long since surrendered its original shine. The metal carried honest scars from decades of work, and every part of the machine reflected years of careful maintenance rather than expensive restoration. Yet people who recognized Harold rarely looked at the tractor first because they had spent much of their lives bringing broken equipment to the small repair shop, where he quietly helped keep the county's farms running through planting seasons, harvest emergencies, and difficult years when replacing machinery simply wasn't an option. More than one farmer standing near the competition field could still remember Harold refusing payment after repairing a tractor for a young family struggling through a poor season, always insisting that keeping a farm alive mattered more than collecting another invoice. The atmosphere changed only a few minutes later when Tyler Brooks drove onto the fairgrounds inside a brand-new John Deere equipped with every modern feature most farmers could only admire from a distance. And although nobody questioned that Tyler had worked hard to build one of the fastest-growing farming operations in the county, success had gradually given him a confidence that sometimes sounded less like pride in his accomplishments and more like certainty that nobody else's experience could possibly equal his own. As spectators gathered around the polished green tractor, Tyler climbed down, glanced across the line of competitors waiting for inspection, and laughed loudly enough for those nearby to hear, before pointing toward Harold's Farmall and asking whether someone had accidentally parked the junkyard exhibit in the competition instead of beside the antique displays, a remark that drew uncomfortable laughter from several people who respected Harold too much to enjoy the joke, but felt equally uncomfortable challenging a younger man enjoying the attention of the growing crowd. Tyler seemed encouraged by the reaction because he walked confidently back to his tractor, reached into the cab, removed a leather briefcase from behind the driver's seat, and calmly counted $10,000 in $100 bills before spreading the money across the hood of the John Deere, where everyone could see it. The conversations around the machinery grounds gradually faded as more people drifted toward the gathering crowd, and Tyler waited until he was certain enough eyes were watching before announcing that if anyone honestly believed an old Farmall could outperform his Deere in the county plowing challenge, the money was theirs for the taking. When nobody answered immediately, he looked directly at Harold and smiled before adding that he hoped the old mechanic had remembered to bring a tow chain because he would hate for the first breakdown to delay lunch for the rest of the competitors, a remark that produced another round of uneasy laughter from people who were beginning to realize the challenge had become less about tractors than about publicly embarrassing one of the county's most respected men. Harold never responded to the insults with anger because he simply rested one weathered hand against the faded hood of the Farmall and quietly explained that he hadn't driven to the fair to gamble, having spent far too many years teaching younger farmers that pride usually costs far more than money ever will. Tyler dismissed the answer with an amused shake of his head and suggested that refusing the bet was probably the smartest decision the old tractor had made all morning. Yet, before the conversation could go any further, Fair Chairman Ben Calloway stepped calmly between the two men and reminded Harold that he owed nobody proof of his ability, although he also admitted that every now and then arrogance learns its most valuable lessons only after someone chooses to answer it with quiet confidence instead of louder words. Harold looked across the freshly marked competition field, then slowly back toward the crowd that had watched him help keep their farms running for more than 40 years, and after a long moment he accepted the challenge without raising his voice or changing his expression, because he understood something Tyler Brooks had not yet learned. The contest waiting out in the field had never really been about tractors at all. As the crowd slowly dispersed toward the competition field to prepare for the opening round of the plowing challenge, Harold guided the old Farmall to a quiet corner of the staging area, where competitors completed their final inspections before the judges signaled everyone to their starting positions. While several operators busied themselves polishing fenders, wiping dust from windshields, or discussing horsepower figures, Harold reached instead for a small canvas tool bag that looked almost as old as the tractor itself, removing only a clean shop rag, a tire gauge, and a well-worn wrench before walking carefully around the Farmall one final time. His movements were slow but deliberate because he wasn't searching for problems as much as he was listening for reassurance, occasionally resting his hand against the engine block or adjusting a linkage by the smallest fraction until every sound and every movement matched the machine he had rebuilt piece by piece with his own hands. Watching Harold prepare reminded many older farmers of another time because, long before retirement, his repair shop had become the place where people arrived carrying more worry than money whenever a tractor failed during planting or harvest. It wasn't unusual for lights to remain burning inside Harold's workshop well past midnight, while anxious families waited outside, hoping their only tractor would be running again before sunrise. And although he charged fairly whenever people could afford it, nobody in Carter County ever forgot the seasons when Harold quietly repaired equipment for widows, young couples, or struggling farmers who promised to settle the bill after harvest. More often than not, those promises quietly disappeared because Harold believed that a family with a working tractor had far more important things to spend their money on than repaying an old mechanic who already considered himself fortunate enough to spend his life doing work he loved. That reputation hadn't been built on natural talent alone, because Harold often credited everything he knew to the lessons his own father taught him inside a weathered machine shed, where broken engines became classrooms instead of frustrations. Whenever impatience tempted the young Harold to replace parts before understanding the real problem, his father would simply smile, hand him the same wrench back, and remind him that every machine tells the truth to people patient enough to listen before reaching for the tools. Those words stayed with Harold long after his father was gone, shaping not only the way he repaired tractors, but also the way he treated people, because he eventually realized that both machines and human beings usually reveal what they need if someone cares enough to pay attention before making assumptions. Across the staging area, Tyler Brooks prepared very differently, confidently explaining the John Deere's advanced features to anyone willing to listen, while proudly describing its horsepower, computerized controls, and precision technology, leaving little doubt that he expected the competition to confirm everything he already believed about modern equipment. Harold never interrupted those conversations because he had no interest in arguing about tractors before either machine had turned a single furrow. Yet, as officials finally waved the competitors toward the freshly marked field, one of the oldest judges quietly glanced at Harold's Farmall before smiling to himself, knowing that many of the younger spectators were about to learn the same lesson Carter County had spent decades discovering: one repair, one harvest, and one quiet act of kindness at a time. By mid-morning, the grandstands overlooking the competition field had filled with families carrying lawn chairs, children perched on wooden fences, and farmers who understood that the annual plowing challenge was never decided by the size of an engine alone, because the judges were interested in far more than speed. Every competitor had been assigned an identical section of ground. Each furrow would be measured for straightness, consistency, and depth. Fuel consumption would be recorded before and after the event, and any unnecessary strain placed on the machinery counted against the operator just as surely as uneven plowing did. Older competitors nodded quietly as the rules were reviewed because they had heard them dozens of times before, while many younger spectators continued whispering that the contest had probably ended the moment Tyler Brooks parked his John Deere beside Harold Mason's faded Farmall. Tyler climbed into the cab, wearing the relaxed smile of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided, because everything about the morning had reinforced the confidence he carried into the fairgrounds. His tractor represented the newest generation of agricultural engineering. The engine produced more horsepower than Harold's Farmall could ever hope to match, and the technology surrounding him promised levels of precision that older machines simply weren't designed to achieve. Before the starting signal sounded, Tyler looked across the field toward Harold, tipped the brim of his cap with a grin that several people interpreted as one final reminder of the $10,000 resting safely inside the judge's trailer, and settled comfortably into the driver's seat as though he expected little more than a routine demonstration of modern machinery. Harold prepared differently because he spent the final moments before the competition with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while the other briefly adjusted the throttle until the engine settled into the familiar rhythm he had listened to for years. He wasn't thinking about Tyler, the money, or the growing crowd because his attention remained fixed on the field stretching ahead, carefully studying the slight rise near the center, the darker soil toward the eastern edge, and the narrow strip where recent rain had left the ground holding just a little more moisture than the rest of the course. Those details appeared insignificant to most people watching from the fence, yet Harold knew that fields reveal their personalities the same way people do, because neither one behaves exactly the same from one corner to the next. When the starting flag finally dropped, both tractors moved forward together, yet the difference between them became obvious almost immediately because Tyler's John Deere covered ground with impressive speed, while the Farmall advanced at a pace that seemed almost leisurely by comparison. The crowd responded exactly as Harold expected, cheering each time the green tractor reached another marker first, while several younger spectators exchanged confident smiles that suggested the old mechanic had finally reached the limit of what experience alone could accomplish. Even some of Harold's longtime friends quietly admitted to one another that the newer machine looked every bit as dominant as Tyler had promised, although none of them noticed Harold making tiny adjustments to his speed each time the texture of the soil changed beneath the plow. The judges noticed, however, because they spent far less time watching the tractors than they did examining the furrows left behind them, measuring depth with steel gauges, checking straightness with tightly stretched lines, and recording observations that the crowd couldn't possibly see from the grandstands. By the end of the opening section, Tyler had completed his pass first and climbed briefly from the cab, wearing the confident expression of a man already imagining how he would collect his winnings. But before the officials announced the preliminary scores, the chief judge quietly informed every competitor that overnight irrigation for next week's field demonstrations had left the remaining section of ground considerably heavier than expected. A ripple of conversation spread through the crowd as everyone turned toward the darker stretch waiting beyond the halfway marker. And while most spectators assumed the additional challenge would simply allow Tyler's powerful John Deere to extend its advantage even further, Harold looked across the heavier soil with the calm recognition of someone who had spent a lifetime learning that a field often reveals its true character only after the easy ground has been left behind. The second half of the competition began with far less confidence than the first, because the darker section of the field looked noticeably different even from the grandstands, and farmers who had worked enough seasons in Kentucky's clay soils immediately recognized the challenge waiting beneath the surface. Overnight, irrigation intended for next week's demonstration plots had soaked that end of the course more heavily than expected, leaving the topsoil soft enough to appear harmless, while hiding heavier ground below that could quickly expose the difference between simply driving a tractor and truly understanding how to work a difficult field. Tyler noticed the change as soon as he stepped back into the cab, but after looking once at the horsepower figures displayed on the instrument panel, he smiled to himself because he couldn't imagine conditions that a machine with that much power wouldn't overcome. When the signal was given, Tyler attacked the heavier ground exactly as he had approached the first half of the competition, maintaining the same aggressive pace that had impressed the crowd earlier in the morning, yet within the first few passes, the field began asking different questions than the ones horsepower alone could answer. The additional moisture caused the soil to cling stubbornly to the plow, forcing the tractor to work harder with every yard it covered, and although the John Deere possessed more than enough strength to keep moving, the increased resistance gradually made it more difficult to maintain the precise depth and perfectly straight furrows the judges continued measuring with quiet concentration. From the grandstands, the tractor still looked powerful, but the men carrying measuring rods along the edge of the field began writing more frequently in their scorebooks. Harold reached the heavier section only moments later, and before the Farmall's front wheels entered the darker soil, he eased back on the throttle, adjusted the plow by a fraction that most people never noticed, and allowed the tractor to settle into a slower rhythm that seemed almost cautious compared with Tyler's determined pace. Several younger spectators whispered that the old mechanic had finally admitted defeat, because the Farmall now appeared even slower than before. Yet a few retired farmers, standing near the fence, exchanged knowing glances as they watched Harold's hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. They had seen that same expression countless times over the years, because Harold wasn't trying to force the field to accept his plan. He was allowing the field itself to tell him how it wanted to be worked. Halfway through the final section, Tyler suddenly felt the John Deere hesitate just long enough to draw his attention toward the control panel, where a warning light briefly flashed before disappearing again, forcing the tractor's onboard system to momentarily reduce power while it verified that everything was operating safely. The interruption lasted only seconds and never developed into a serious mechanical problem, but those few seconds disrupted Tyler's rhythm just enough that he instinctively compensated with more throttle than the conditions required, causing the rear tires to dig slightly deeper into the softened ground before he quickly regained control. Harold never saw the warning light because he wasn't watching Tyler at all, yet he quietly guided the Farmall through the same stretch of soil with the patience of someone who understood that difficult ground rarely rewards people who hurry through it. By the time both tractors completed their final passes, the atmosphere surrounding the competition had changed completely, because the laughter that greeted Harold earlier that morning had given way to quiet conversations among farmers studying the rows left behind each machine. Even spectators with little experience around tractors could see that something had shifted, although few were prepared for what the judges were discovering as they walked slowly from one furrow to the next with measuring rods, notebooks, and expressions that grew more thoughtful with every careful inspection. Tyler climbed down from the John Deere, looking far less certain than he had only an hour earlier, while Harold simply wiped a little dust from the Farmall's hood before thanking the old tractor in the same gentle way he had after finishing countless ordinary days in ordinary fields, never imagining that the greatest lesson of the afternoon was about to be delivered not by either man, but by the quiet numbers waiting inside the judges' scorecards. The judges took their time before announcing the results because nobody wanted a decision that could be questioned after so much attention had gathered around the county plowing challenge. And while they moved methodically across the field, measuring furrow depth, checking straightness, comparing fuel records, and reviewing every score sheet, the crowd remained unusually quiet as conversations that had once centered on Tyler Brooks's confident predictions slowly shifted toward Harold Mason's steady performance through the difficult ground. More than one farmer admitted that the old Farmall had looked almost too slow to compete during the opening passes, yet those same farmers now found themselves walking closer to Harold's rows, studying the clean, even furrows that stretched across the heavier clay with a consistency few of them expected to see from a tractor nearly half a century older than the machine parked beside it. Tyler stood near his John Deere, trying to appear relaxed, although anyone watching closely could see that the certainty he carried into the competition had begun giving way to anxious curiosity, because he had never doubted the tractor's strength. What unsettled him was the realization that the judges seemed far more interested in details he had barely considered throughout the morning. And for the first time since placing $10,000 on the hood, he quietly replayed the heavier section of the field in his mind, remembering the brief warning light, the extra throttle, and the small corrections that had seemed insignificant while he was making them. Harold, meanwhile, remained beside the Farmall answering questions from a pair of young boys fascinated by the old tractor's exposed engine, patiently explaining how every machine rewards people who care for it consistently instead of expecting it to perform miracles only when everyone happens to be watching. When the chief judge finally stepped onto the small wooden platform near the finish line, the conversations stopped almost immediately because everyone understood the afternoon's biggest lesson was only moments away. He thanked every competitor for preserving one of the county's oldest traditions before explaining that the closest contests were rarely decided by horsepower or speed alone, and after briefly reviewing the scoring categories, he announced that Tyler Brooks had recorded the fastest overall time, while Harold Mason had received the highest combined marks for furrow consistency, plowing depth, fuel efficiency, equipment control, and field management. The final margin separated the two men by fewer points than anyone expected, yet it was enough for the chief judge to quietly congratulate Harold Mason as the winner of the Carter County Plowing Challenge. For several long moments, the fairgrounds remained almost silent, because the result forced everyone present to reconsider what they believed they had watched throughout the day. And it wasn't until one of the older farmers removed his cap and began applauding that the rest of the crowd gradually joined him. Tyler lowered his eyes toward the money still resting inside the judge's trailer before walking slowly across the field carrying the envelope containing the $10,000, and although disappointment showed plainly on his face, he stopped in front of Harold, held out the envelope, and admitted that a bet was only worth making if a man's word meant something after he lost. Harold accepted the envelope only long enough to place it gently back into Tyler's hands, because he smiled with the same quiet kindness that had carried him through every insult that morning, before explaining that he had never entered the competition hoping to win another man's money. He told Tyler that the county had already given him everything he needed through years of friendship, honest work, and neighbors who trusted him with their machines, adding that if the younger farmer truly wanted to honor the bet, he should keep the money and spend it becoming the kind of farmer whose reputation was built as carefully as his equipment. Tyler looked down at the envelope without saying a word because he suddenly understood that the greatest loss he suffered that afternoon had nothing to do with $10,000. It was realizing that the old man he had tried to embarrass possessed something no amount of money could ever purchase, and as the crowd quietly watched the two men shake hands beside a faded red Farmall, many left the fair believing they had witnessed something far more valuable than a tractor competition. The story might have ended there if all anyone remembered was an old Farmall defeating a brand-new John Deere, but the people of Carter County would later say the most important part of that September afternoon didn't happen out in the plowing field because it happened several weeks later on an ordinary Tuesday morning when a dusty green pickup truck pulled quietly into Harold Mason's small repair shop. There were no grandstands, no prize money, and no crowd waiting to see what happened next. Only the familiar smell of engine oil, weathered wooden workbenches covered with decades of carefully organized tools, and an old mechanic who looked up from rebuilding a worn hydraulic pump before smiling as Tyler Brooks stepped hesitantly through the open doorway. Tyler stood silently for a moment because he had rehearsed many different ways to begin the conversation during the drive across the county, yet every speech disappeared the instant he saw Harold working with the same quiet patience that had carried him through the competition. He finally admitted that losing the plowing challenge had bothered him far less than realizing how many things he still didn't understand, explaining that he had spent years believing better equipment automatically made someone a better farmer without appreciating that machines only perform as well as the judgment of the person operating them. Harold listened without interrupting because experience had taught him that genuine humility should never be rushed. And after Tyler finished speaking, the old mechanic simply handed him a wrench before pointing toward the disassembled hydraulic pump resting on the workbench. For the rest of that morning they worked side by side without speaking very much because Harold preferred teaching through patient demonstration instead of long lectures, occasionally asking Tyler why he thought a certain part had failed, or encouraging him to stop looking at individual pieces and begin understanding how every component depended upon the others. Whenever Tyler reached too quickly for a replacement part, Harold gently reminded him of the lesson his own father had taught decades earlier by saying that machines usually tell the truth to people willing to listen before reaching for the wrench. And by the time the repaired pump quietly came back to life on the testing bench, Tyler realized those words applied just as naturally to people as they did to tractors, because pride often prevents both from revealing what they really need. The month that followed became something of an unexpected tradition throughout Carter County because whenever Harold's shop door stood open on Saturday mornings, Tyler's pickup was usually parked outside beside it, and farmers passing along the county road gradually grew accustomed to seeing the youngest successful farmer in the area learning from the oldest mechanic instead of trying to impress him. Harold never attempted to turn Tyler into someone exactly like himself because he admired the younger man's ambition, willingness to work, and eagerness to embrace new technology, choosing instead to help him understand that progress becomes strongest when it respects the wisdom that came before it, rather than pretending it no longer matters. Perhaps that's why the people who witnessed the famous $10,000 bet eventually stopped telling the story as one about a John Deere losing to an old Farmall because the tractors had never really been the point. What stayed with them was the memory of one man discovering that experience cannot be purchased, another proving that wisdom never needs to humiliate someone in order to teach them, and a county quietly realizing that the strongest communities are built when one generation is willing to learn from another instead of laughing at it. Harold Mason didn't leave the fair with $10,000 because he had already spent a lifetime collecting something far more valuable, the respect that only years of honest work, quiet character, and generous teaching can earn. If you had been standing beside that competition field on that cool September morning, would you have placed your money on the newest machine or on the oldest mechanic? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from, because every place has stories like this waiting to be remembered. If stories about quiet wisdom, rural life, and the people who shape their communities one season at a time are the kind you enjoy, we'd love to have you join us by subscribing, because here on The Last Acre, We share a brand new story every day. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on The Last Acre, where every acre has a story, every field remembers, and the quiet lessons of yesterday still have the power to shape tomorrow. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you tomorrow with another story.